Hey, before we get started with the show, we want to let you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is sponsored by Audible.com.
That's right. They have more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. They're the leading audiobook publishers, and you can choose such comics-related titles as Sean Howe's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, and David Haydu's The 10-Cent Plague.
Get a free audiobook of your choice at www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative and get started today. This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Monster and Enclosed Called Fat.
Quaker Oats. It's the right thing to do.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys talking about manga. And for our July manga show, we've got two very interesting titles to discuss. We're going to start off with Naoki Urasawa's Monster, the 5th volume of the Perfect Edition. Came out just this month from Viz Media. And then after that, we're going to read Enclosed Called Fat, work that was collected last year from Vertical by Moyoco Anno. But before we get into our discussion of those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga series is brought to you by the incredible, the wonderful, the fabulous folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, and they'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you will find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles regularly 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Now, we're into the tail end, the very tail end of July, but you can still probably get things under the wire. And there you'll find the specials for this month at 45% off cover price. Sometimes they're 50% off, but many times you'll find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything, any manga that's 50% off. You could probably find some, but you can certainly find things like Fairy Tail by Hiro Mashima at 30% off, and a Triple X Holic by Clamp at 30% off. So maybe not 50, but still very good deals.
Yeah, well, whether it is 20% off or 50% off or even more, I swear you cannot beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. And they don't mind late orders, and so if we get into the early days of August, you can go ahead and get your July orders in. They're that nice. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Shea, another month, and here we are to talk about more manga. How have you been doing over the past several weeks?
Oh, pretty good. I've, in addition to these ones that we're going to talk about today, I just picked up Sunny by Taya Matsumoto and Helter Skelter by Kyoko Akazaki. So I'm kind of I got quite a few manga titles to talk about, and that's really where I'm at with comics right now. What about you?
Well, cool. You know, it's all I can do to keep up with all of the reading that I need to do for the podcast for the various episodes that I co-host. So, and I know that our listeners have probably heard me say this many times. I haven't read any additional manga outside of what we're reading for this month. But some of the things that you had just mentioned, the Helter Skelter, that's one on my to-read list. I want to eventually get around to that. And I know that you and I have discussed about a future show where we will discuss Sunny.
Yeah, because we're both pretty big fans of that, right?
Yeah, and when is the next volume of that coming out?
I am not sure, but I just learned that it is the very last volume, so maybe that would be the perfect time to talk about the whole series.
Oh, great. Yeah, that would be kind of a long haul discussion, but I think well worth it.
Oh yeah, that's a really rich series, so definitely.
Okay, so something to look forward to and something that our listeners can hold our feet to the fire with.
Yeah. Hopefully they hold us to that, because I want to actually get into that. So.
Oh, we will, my friend. We will. So you want to get into our discussion with this month's manga titles?
Absolutely. I guess we're going to start off with Monster, right?
That's right. We're going to start off with Monster, written by Naoki Urasawa. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Monster, Shea, how familiar are you with the works of Urasawa?
I'm probably more familiar with than most people. This is the first work of his that I've really given a lot of time to, but I'm aware of, and I've seen some of Pluto, and I haven't read Billy Bat yet because it's not available in English, but I've seen pages of it that it looks really good. 20th Century Boys is another one that I've read just a very small amount of, but what I read of it was really strong. But this is the first series of his that I've really read in full, or up to this point, almost half of the series so far. What about you? Have you read Pluto or 20th Century Boys before?
No, but all of these titles, and including Monster, have been on my manga to read list, or I guess just my, in general, to read list for a while. I've got a couple of volumes of Pluto that are sitting just waiting for me, so I need to get to that. And one of the things that drew me to that is I was reading that it's kind of a futuristic reworking of Asuma Tezuka's Astro Boy. So that struck my attention. So that's one that's been on my to read list for a while. And then 20th Century Boys, I haven't read that yet, but a few years ago that was recommended to me by my oldest nephew, John, and I don't think he listens to the podcast, but if you are John, I appreciate the recommendation. I haven't gotten around to reading 20th Century Boys yet, but that's another one on my to-read list. But I've also heard a lot of good things about Mr. Keaton. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar? Have you read any of that? I
had meant to pick up the first volume, but I hadn't gotten a chance, and that's actually an interesting one because it's from much earlier in Urasawa's career than Monster or 20th Century Boys, and that's, I don't know if you're familiar with how Viz has released his works, but from what I understand, contractually they were only allowed to release his works in the order in which they appeared in Japan because he wanted people to kind of follow along with his growth as a cartoonist. So Master Keaton, the fact that that is a much earlier work being released, I believe re-released now, is it's interesting within that context to people who like that stuff, like me, who like the behind the scenes stuff. But that I haven't gotten a chance to check out yet. But I hear very good things about that one as well.
Huh. Now, see, I didn't hear about the contractual agreement that he has with Viz in order to release his material as it originally appeared, or at least in terms of when it came out, one right after the other, the order in the original Japanese. But that's interesting to know, and it makes sense to me because that way you could see the evolution of the growth of the creator, as opposed to, let's say, the very first thing you read of his would be something like Pluto or a more recent work, and then later on they release something that is earlier in his career, like Mr. Keaton or Happy, and then you get a sense, is he just that much different? Is he moving backwards, or is this a forward movement in terms of his creation, his abilities? It just makes sense to me. Now, that leads us into maybe a little more context about the title that we're discussing this month, and that is, or one of the titles, and that's Monster. Now, Monster originally was serialized in Big Comic Original Magazine between December of 1994 and then December of 2001, and then later collected in Japanese, and then in the U.S. through Viz in 18 individual volumes. Now, beginning last year, and I can't remember when last year, it's been maybe a little over a year.
They were released every 3 months, so
yes.
I guess 15 months ago.
You're anticipating the next thing I was going to say is, so Viz did release the 18 volumes series, but then beginning last year, a little more than a year ago, they started to release what they call the Perfect Edition. So it's the Monster Perfect Edition. And the Perfect Editions, if I understand correctly, they're basically 2 of those 18 volumes in one.
Yeah, they're the 2, and then you get nice French flaps, and the covers all form a single image.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, it's every 3 months that these are coming out. Mm-hmm. So right now we're up to volume 5 of Monster, the Perfect Edition. And in fact, volume 5 came out just about not even 2 weeks ago as we record this.
Yeah, I think last Wednesday, if my memory serves.
Yeah.
So not too long ago.
Yeah. So, this is something, you and I pledged that every month we would look at least one new or relatively recent, depending on how you define recent, title. And Monster definitely does fall within that because these Perfect Editions are relatively new, and Volume 5 just came out, I guess a tad more than a week ago now. So, well, let's go ahead and get into Monster. And if you were going to set this up, not necessarily an elevator pitch or an escalator pitch for that matter, but if you were going to set this up to someone who had no idea, had heard nothing about Urasawa's Monster, how would you describe it?
I would say that the bulk of the drama is about a Japanese surgeon in, I guess, Germany. It begins before the Berlin Wall comes down. I believe he's in West Germany, or West Berlin, and
right.
Yeah, that's West
he's
Germany.
In Dusseldorf, isn't he?
Is he? I can't remember where he begins. It might be Dusseldorf, where he's first working at the start of it. But he's a surgeon. He's a Japanese surgeon living and working in Germany. Very successful.
Dusseldorf, yes. It begins at Eisler Memorial Hospital in Dusseldorf.
Okay, and his name is and his name is Kenzo Tenma, and he is 2 children arrive and they require surgery, and he saves the children, and they seem like normal children, regular children, and then a couple days later they disappear, and then 10 years later he finds out that a serial killer who is currently active and has been killing people the last couple of years is one of the children he saved, and he kind of obligates himself to stop the titular monster that he helped to survive and helped to put out in the world. He feels a little bit responsible for. But what's that's I think we would agree is really what drives the majority of what we see in the series.
Right.
But
although
thinking about it.
Let me just jump in here because there's an important point there that you left out, and that is that one of the kids that he saves, Johann. In fact, Johann and his sister Anna, they go by the name of Liebert when we first see them, and they've just recently come over. We find out with a family from East Germany. And they've come over in 1986, and then soon after the family gets here, the parents are found dead, murdered, and the kids are mighty beat up. And in fact, Johann is shot in the head. And so the connection between Johann Liebert and Dr. Tenma is that Tenma, when we first see him, he is someone who I guess you could say he was kind of buying into the fast track of his career as a surgeon, because he's there at Eisler Memorial Hospital, and he is engaged to the daughter, the very sexy daughter, Eva, of the director of the hospital, Dr. Heinemann. And Dr. Heinemann basically he's tapping into Kenzo Tenma and his abilities, and exploited as best as he can. For instance, not only using him as, the master surgeon, the young master surgeon of the hospital, but also to write his various research papers, so that he, Dr. Heinemann, can take all of the glory. And of course, Tenma's going along with this, and his fiancée Eva, the daughter of the director, is let's just say she is a high maintenance woman, and it expects a lot from the men around her, specifically Tenma, her fiancé. And then one of the things, though, that sets everything off is that when these kids come in, when Johann and Anna come to the hospital, Anna is in shock. There's nothing physically wrong with her, but Johann has been shot in the head. Tenma, the surgeon, makes a decision to treat Johann because soon after Johann gets there with a head injury, they learn that the mayor of Dusseldorf has also been brought in. And so what the director Heinemann says is, since the mayor is a very high-profile patient, Tenma, you need to attend to him before this young boy who was shot in the head. But Tenma feels, well, Johann's condition seems much more severe, plus he came in first, and he's a kid. So Tenma basically ignores Heinemann's directive and does what his conscience tells him, and that is he treats the boy with a gunshot in his head, Johann. And then what happens is Johann, because of Tenma's skill, survives. The mayor ends up dying, and Tenma is ostracized by the director. Eva, the fiancée, ends their relationship. And then soon after that, there are some deaths, which we'll get into, and then Johann and Anna disappear. And so now Tenma...
And that's...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that's what I was going to say before you added some of that detail.
Sorry.
Did
I step on your toes?
This is actually a perfect kind of segue to what I was going to say. You mentioned all of that detail, and there's so much story that occurs in 1986, 1987, before when Germany is still separated, but in describing kind of what I thought was the description of the series as a whole, that is really you don't really you get all of that in the first, I guess what would be the first volume, the first half of these perfect editions.
It's about the first third, really.
But then that's all just set up. All of that detail that you described, that's all set up for the rest of the series, and it takes almost a whole, I guess, what would be a normal volume of this to get into the bulk of the series, which occurs, almost 10 years after that, and so I was just going to note that, but like I said, you adding all that detail allowed me to perfectly segue into that. It's a deceptively complicated series to describe because of that. Yeah, so there's kind of this time jumps.
Yeah, there are a number of time jumps as you get into the later volumes and later perfect editions that we're specifically talking about. And yeah, you're right in underscoring the fact that there are a lot of moving parts in this narrative. You have quite a number of characters, and that number grows the more you get into the story. You get different storylines, or at least subplots that begin going on. And in fact, I asked you at the outset how you would describe this to the uninitiated. The way I would respond to a question like that is very, very simple, probably too simple, and that is The Fugitive in manga form. You remember the old show from the 1960s, The Fugitive? I don't know if you...
I'm much too young.
I didn't see it in the original, but you didn't see it like maybe on TV Land or on reruns in some sort?
No, I'm familiar with it because I've seen the the movie, the more recent movie, but I haven't seen any of the original series.
Okay.
But
the movie would
I
work
understand
as
the
well.
gist of the
Yeah, but especially the television series, because you have Dr. Kimball, who is accused of killing someone that he didn't kill, which is, in The Fugitive, it was his wife, and it was someone else who did it. And so Dr. Kimball then is on the run from the authorities, and you have something similar going on in Monster. But another reason why Kimball is on the run is to find the person that he thinks murdered his wife, and that is the guy with the missing arm. And so there's something similar in that way with Monster as well, because Tenma is not only on the run from the authorities, and specifically he's being chased down by Inspector Lunge. Lunge becomes his antagonist in this series. And I can't remember the doctor's or the officer's name in the Fugitive TV series. But the character that Tenma is trying to seek is and finds ever elusive is Johann Liebert. And so in the initial setup, I found it quite similar to the setup of The Fugitive. And then another thing that reminded me of The Fugitive, and much more the television series than the movie, is because The Fugitive was a television series, and every week there had to be another plot, that Kimball had to move on to another place where he would meet other people and then get involved in their stories, and then the next week he'd move to another place and meet other people and then get involved in their stories. And sometimes these stories would overlap with the overarching story that Kimball was a part of. And I think you have something similar going on in Monster, as you pointed out, that as you get deeper into this narrative, there are more and more stories, more and more characters that we're introduced to. And some pop up at one point, and then we don't see them for a while. Later on, they may pop up again, so their story comes back. But then sometimes these are interspersed with other stories or linked with other stories. And it can get very, very complex, but in a very good and engaging way. So I think in that way, it also reminds me of the television series, The Fugitive.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think your point of comparison with The Fugitive is much better than what I was kind of thinking of when I was reading about halfway through Volume 4, Volume 5. I started thinking, wow, this is really reminding me of the Incredible Hulk show.
Well, but that makes sense, though.
I think The Fugitive is... Yeah, but I think The Fugitive is a little better a comparison. But that's where I was at with it. I just kept kind of thinking of... Bill Bixby showing up in a town, having an adventure, and then going on to the next one to have another adventure. There's certainly a lot of stuff particularly in the fourth and fifth volume that relates to the kind of larger story. But in the third and fourth volume, there's a bunch of kind of one-off, self-contained stories similar to kind of The Fugitive or The Incredible Hulk, where Tenma and a child that he meets along the way, Dieter, they just kind of have an adventure, kind of like a one-off adventure. And but I think that The Fugitive is a much stronger comparison than The Incredible Hulk on that one.
Yeah. Well, for me, The Fugitive immediately came to mind because both Kimball and Tenma are successful doctors. And so when they go someplace, of course, they both taken the Hippocratic Oath, so they have to care for those who need medical assistance. Mm-hmm. So they'll go somewhere, in both narratives, both The Fugitive and Monster, and then someone will need, surgery or some kind of emergency procedure or something. Mm-hmm. And, these doctors, they see to those people, and then others around them, who is this person? And why does he seem on the run? Mm-hmm. Is he a famous surgeon? And so there's something similar going on there. Now, you mentioned the companion, Dieter, and I think, does Dieter come in the second Perfect volume or the tail end of the first? He's in
I believe it's the second one.
Okay. Now, when he comes into play, he becomes kind of a reluctant companion, a younger companion to Tenma. Tenma ends up saving him from another character who is, one of the, many big nasties that we see in mm-hmm. Monster. And even though Tenma doesn't necessarily want Dieter to follow him, Dieter does. So he sticks like a burr to Tenma. But when Dieter came on board, for a moment I was thinking, is this going to turn into something like a lone wolf and cub deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
But
it doesn't. so much turn into that because, Dieter is really his companion for a really surprisingly small amount of time. He kind of, it's not like a spoiler to say that Tenma kind of foists Dieter onto these other characters that are introduced in the third and fourth volume that end up playing a pretty pivotal role. But yeah, there was that kind of, it did threaten to become that at a certain point. But it threatens to become a lot of things at a lot of points. Like you mentioned, being reminded of The Fugitive because Tenma and Kimball are both doctors. When I saw those kind of one-off stories of Tenma helping people and using his like kind of medical expertise to help people, I was really reminded of Osamu Tezuka's Blackjack, which is just a collection of these short one-off stories about this kind of he's just a surgeon who just does weird surgeries, and I was like, is it going to become that, or is it going to keep doing this other thing? And so it does threaten to become all of these different things at various points. I don't know if you were reminded of anything else besides The Fugitive with those.
No, but something that you mentioned just a second ago is when Tenma at various times foists or tries to foist Dieter onto other people that he meets along the way. I think the first instance of this, and I was trying to remember the guy's name. Remember the thief? Who basically functions as comic relief. And he looks really goofy. He's got, looks like buck teeth or rabbit teeth is what it reminds me of. We see him at the very beginning of the second perfect volume, and then about 2/3 of the way, and then he disappears. And so then we get into 2/3 of this second perfect volume, and he pops up again, and we find out that Tenma has given Dieter to this thief to take care of while he goes off to see to something. And I think this is where that comedic aspect of the thief, and I cannot recall his name. I'm looking through the volume now trying to find it.
He's the one who helps when Tenma tries to prevent the fire in the Turkish quarter, right?
Exactly, yeah. He has the kind of rabbit buck
remember
teeth
his name
and the ponytail.
Either. Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about, but I can't remember his name either.
Yeah. So, but I mentioned this not only as an example of another character that Dieter has to hang out with for a while, but to point out that the difference in character that pops up every now and again in Monster. We've already mentioned a few times that there are a lot of characters. This is a very heavy narrative, but every now and again we find certain characters that stand out because they, if not lighten, then change the very dark tone of Monster. And this thief, whose name neither of us can remember right now, is one of these characters. And there are other characters that play this role as well. Not necessarily as comic reliefs, but maybe sometimes more warm characters, other times more pathetic characters. I mean, people that we can connect to emotionally in one form or another. So, and I think that that's one way that Urasawa varies the emotional ride as we go through this very long narrative. Again, this was originally 18 volumes long. This is a very long story. So, how are you going to break things up? Well, they're different stories and they're different segments of the narrative where Tenma meets people and gets involved in their lives. But it's also the difference of characters that, at times things get a little dark, other times they're a little comedic, at other times they may be more sentimental. So I think this variation of tone throughout Monster really works effectively.
I think there is something to be said for Urasawa's ability to kind of juggle various tones and to make those shifts and to introduce characters like the thief. And in volume, I think 3, he shows up a forensic psychologist who, every time I looked at him, I was just like, oh my God, Urasawa put Wilfred Brimley in a comic book. This is amazing.
I know. I saw that and I thought, is Quaker Oats the right thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I swore, I was like, I'm going to turn the page and he's going to tell some patient that he has diabetes, and that never happened.
Let's see how many
chagrin.
Let's see how many Wilford Brimley commercial appearances or even TV and movie appearances we can reference in this episode.
Oh, I'd lose that game. I just know the diabetes and the thing. But there's characters like that, and he does vary the tone. But about halfway through Volume 4, I kind of started to feel like that he was kind of leaning on that as a crutch, and it was maybe that wasn't to the detriment necessarily of the book, but I think the reasons he had to keep introducing those characters really worked against the overall quality of the book. I felt like he was introducing those characters to kind of just have an excuse to keep the narrative moving, to keep introducing us new stories and new characters, to just keep pushing it forward and have it keep moving. But around Volume 4, which I guess would have been almost halfway through the series, I started to feel like it was very soap opera-y. It was very fluffy. There wasn't as much substance as there might have been if he had trimmed some of those stories down to about half their length or a quarter of their length. It would have been a much leaner, more compact narrative that I thought would have moved a lot quicker and would have been a lot more engaging. How did you feel about that? How did you feel about that kind of? I guess what I'm asking is does Monster's length work for you? Do you think it justifies 18 volumes at 200 pages apiece?
Well, I for me, this is just another example of long-form comics or long-form manga, and there are a lot of titles that are like this, right, that are originally serialized in, a variety of magazines or one particular magazine, and becomes popular, so the creator, I guess the creator doesn't have to, but if it's a popular enough title, then there is the demand for more and more installments. And so how long are you going to play out the narrative before it kind of topples over, so to speak, of its own weight, or maybe it's time for it to end, but the readers want more and more of this. So you think that as this series is continuing into about its middle, which is around where the fifth volume of the Perfect Edition is, are you thinking that it does lapse into melodrama?
Yeah, I think it starts to kind of bow under its weight. It becomes too flabby, too kind of slow and drawn out, and the kind of one-off medical adventures that Tenma and Dieter go on throughout the third, fourth, and fifth volume. They don't really add anything. They just feel like filler that is just kind of is unnecessary.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the characters. We talked quite a bit about Dieter and of course Tenma, but what is one of the figures of the volumes we've read that stands out to you, either in a good or a bad way?
I think that's a tough question. I think there's some really, really good stuff in the fourth and fifth volumes. But I would like them a lot more if, like I said, some of those stories, some of those one-off stories that just kind of feel like filler, if maybe they had been cut out or weren't in there, I think they would be. I think the third and fourth volume would be really strong without some of that filler. But I don't know if there's one that really stands out as really more exceptional than the other ones. I don't know. Was there one that really jumped out for you, that worked more for you than the other ones?
Well, maybe not one that worked for me better than the others, but two I'd like to lump together that stand out, at least something I'd like to say about them, are both Inspector Lunge and Eva Heinemann. Now, again, Eva is the daughter of the former director who was killed, murdered, the director of the hospital, and Tenma's former fiancé. There are times in Monster where Eva and Inspector Lunge become somewhat human, and we get to see different facets of their lives. And I think that Urasawa takes us at times close to a point of empathy for both of these characters at different moments. But then things change and we're pulled back. Like, for instance, there is one point relatively late in the second volume of the Perfect Edition where we see, after not having seen Inspector Lunge for a while, he comes back into the narrative, and we should mention that Lunge is what is it called in Germany? It's it's like the German equivalent of the FBI. It's the B.
BKA, I believe.
BKA, that's right. And so he is the BKA agent in charge of this earlier murder, and so he thinks that Tenma is the one who committed all of those murders at the very beginning and is continuing to do so even 10 years later, where basically we pick up, as you mentioned, about a third of the way into the first Perfect volume. So Lunge is very methodical. He is very mathematic and logical in his thinking, and he is definitely a unique character. One of the first things that we notice about him is the twitching of his hand. And in fact, there's even sound effects that tuck, 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 that go with his hand. And sometimes he'll tap it on the side of his leg. Sometimes he'll tap it on a table or something. And fairly early on, one of the characters, and it may be Dr. Tenma, I'm not sure, asks him why he's doing that. And he mentions that what he's doing, figuratively speaking, is tapping information into his brain, kind of like you would to tap information into a keyboard in making notes on a computer. So he's doing that, and he does it in a way that I think is really creepy, because he's one of these characters, and we have quite a number of them so far in Monster, who are very good at and thorough at what they do, but what they do isn't very nice. But they do so in kind of a cold and detached, especially emotionally detached way. And this is how I see Inspector Lunge. Now, the aforementioned empathic almost moment. Toward the end of the second Perfect volume, when Inspector Lunge comes back into play, we also see a part of his family life. Now, this is someone who is so obsessed with his work. I mean, to call him a workaholic, I think, would be an understatement. He is so obsessed with his work that he alienates both his wife and his older daughter, his daughter, and his daughter's older. And so he doesn't know not only what's going on in the life of his daughter, but apparently he doesn't even know what's going on in the life of his wife, because his wife, right before she and her daughter leave the house, she says to him, "You didn't even know that I had a lover." And then they leave. And so there, in those scenes around that time when we see Inspector Lunge obsessed with the Tenma case, but at the same time there are parts of his family that we see that they're outside of his awareness. I think that there's the potential for us to see a more human side of Lunge, but then Urasawa takes us just to the edge of that empathic understanding and then pulls back. And that was a little frustrating, because I wanted to feel the more human side of Lunge. Maybe that's my problem. And I feel that there's something similar that goes on with Eva Heinemann as well. Remember, and I can't remember, this is the first or the second Perfect volume, but at one point Eva, she basically demonstrates herself to be a very superficial, nasty person. Once Tenma alienates her, Eva's father, the director, by defying his demand to cede to the mayor over Johann and his head injury. That's it for Tenma, and that's it for Tenma and, his fiancée Eva. She basically doesn't even give, she drops the engagement ring on the floor in front of him and basically says, you screwed up. Because you're not one of, the golden chosen people right now, because you chose to defy my father, and you are not going to be one of the up and coming doctors at this hospital. I want nothing to do with you. So she shows her superficiality, toward the very beginning. But at one point, and I think this may be in the first Perfect volume, we see her, and it's about 10 years later, and she has gone through 2 marriages, is very unhappy. Of course, she's benefited financially by that. Her father was well off, so she inherited that money when he was murdered. And then apparently she's gotten the wealth of the husbands that she went through fairly quickly. And so here we have a very, very wealthy divorcee who is used to, the good life of people paying attention to her, used to being the center of attention. And we see her unhappy. She's an alcoholic. She has a drinking problem. And she is on the couch and she's looking longingly at a photograph of her and Tenma when they were engaged. And at one point around this time, I remember feeling, we're going to see a reformed Eva. But again, Urasawa takes us right to the edge of that empathic connection and then pulls back. In fact, dramatically with Eva, because after that, she becomes, I think the best way of describing her is one evil bitch.
Yeah.
And then she becomes more of a stereotype.
I think that's a pretty good way to describe her up until that point. I will say that Urasawa does a much better job of complicating her than he does with Lunge. We get scenes in I believe it's the fourth book, but it could be the fifth Perfect Edition. We get scenes with her where she shows up again, and he does an excellent job of kind of making us question what we think of her. But Lunge, I don't know. He doesn't really get that moment that Eva does. But at the same time, you seem to think that moment where we see his wife and his daughter was meant to make us feel something for him, which is interesting because I felt the complete opposite. I felt Urasawa introduced that scene to really demonstrate to us how almost robotic Lunge was, how detached from regular human emotion he was. But you seem to have a different reading of that scene.
No, actually, I think your reading is probably more accurate than mine. I think mine may have been more of a wish. I think I wanted to see a more human side of Lunge because up to that point he had appeared to me as a two-dimensional character, and I was thinking, okay, well, most of the figures that we see here, with the exception of maybe Eva and Lunge, have been fleshed out fairly well. I mean, even the elusive Johann, this supposedly nasty character who, the titular character of Monster, from what we can see, even he has a complicated life that we can't completely dislike him. He's definitely not a two-dimensional character because there's a lot going on with him, and psychologically especially. So, and we learn a little bit more here and there as Tenma gets into his search. What's going on with Johann and why is he such an evil character apparently. But with Eva and Lunge, they just seem two-dimensional. So maybe I was just wanting more roundedness with Lunge with the introduction of his family. But you're right, he doesn't give us that. I do think, though, that your reading is accurate, that Urasawa gives us that scene in order to show this more, extreme, rational, almost robotic side of him.
Yeah, I mean, even that kind of reading of him has a lot to do with just how we're, not only what we see of him, but the way Urasawa draws him. I mean, listeners, I know you're familiar with kind of Will Eisner's educational comics and educational books where he talks about how a cartoonist should draw a character to communicate something about that character. And thinking about that, the way Urasawa draws Lunge he looks almost reptilian. He looks his face is very angular, very sharp. His eyes are they're beady and almost rat-like just in the way he draws them, and that really affected how I perceived that character. He just felt reptilian to me. He felt very much like a snake or a lizard, someone who wasn't human, who didn't have human emotions, just based solely on the way Urasawa draws him and the way we see him. So I will admit that Urasawa's art kind of affected the way I interpret the things we see Lunge doing and the way we see him behaving.
I think you're right. That's a good observation. The way that Urasawa draws Lunge, because I'm looking back through this and I'm reminded when I first saw Lunge, who I immediately thought of?
Who's that?
Spock, just because of the eyebrows.
I can kind of see that.
And also, except for, let's say, the original pilot of Star Trek, the original Star Trek, I mean, when do we see Spock demonstrate emotion, especially happiness. I mean, it's always this kind of flat, logical veneer, and that's what we have going on in a much more negative way, though, with Lunge. But I think his eyebrows and the way that they flare up, almost like horns, reminded me a little bit of Nimoy's Spock.
Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me, but now that you kind of put it in my head, I can definitely see how you would kind of connect the two. There's definitely some facial similarities, but yeah, he seems. I'm not a big fan of Lynch.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. But, I want to go back to something you said about Eva, and I'd forgotten this scene until I was flipping through this second volume of the Perfect Edition, trying to find a picture of Lunge. There is this scene where Eva takes up with her handyman, and I can't remember the guy's name. Remember, he's the guy who has a young daughter, and his wife has left him. And at first, it seems as if Eva is just toying with him. She flirts with him, and then she beds him, and so she gets sexual gratification out of him. And so at first it seems that this is the old Eva getting what she wants and then tossing aside what she doesn't like. But then there's a moment where here we almost get this kind of warm Christmas scene. Her handyman is spending Christmas with his daughter, and he tells Eva this, and so Eva at first doesn't seem to care, but then she gets him a present, or maybe it's his daughter a present, and we see her walking to this guy's apartment, and she's going to surprise him. And so you're thinking, there's some heart there in Eva after all, right? It's kind of like the Grinch, the heart is growing here, several times its original size. But then something happens, I don't want to give anything away here, to where then she feels betrayed, and then she becomes even more demonic. I mean, to the point of igniting a very, very big fire. So when I say demonic, I mean that in the most hellacious way here.
Yeah, she's... all of the things that you're saying are true. I just think she's I like that. I like what we see of her, and I like how she continues to evolve from that into maybe she doesn't become a good guy or a good character, but she Urasawa definitely complicates her later in the later volumes.
And the reason I brought up this scene just now is to basically underscore what you were saying right now, and that is that there is more complication going on with her character than at least I originally had felt. So, but no, you're right.
Yeah, I haven't personally read any further in Monster than this fifth Perfect Edition. So I don't know what her role in the series is past that, but I would be really interested to see her continue to appear and continue to change and evolve. And I think Urasawa could definitely do some interesting things with her from where he leaves her. But yeah, I can see why Ava would be one of the characters you'd really want to talk about.
Yeah. Now, what do you make of the fact that Urasawa set this in Germany? Because there's a lot of potential there, and also there's much that plays out it taking place in a German setting.
I've thought that, and the only thing I could possibly come up with is why he would be, other than maybe he has a particular fondness for the country, or there was some personal reason unrelated to the story that he really wanted to set in the country. But I think he gets a lot of mileage out of the reunification of Germany once the Berlin Wall comes down. He gets a lot of mileage out of the way the formerly two governments integrate, and that leads to some interesting complications in the narrative. But other than that, I don't know. But that stuff isn't really something he needed to set the story in Germany to accomplish. But I think he does interesting things with the setting and stuff like that. But I think maybe he felt like he needed that kind of quirk in the story to make it work, to make what he had in mind work. But I don't know. Maybe it's some personal reason. I don't know. Did you feel like there was a specific reason he set it in Germany, or?
Well, I can speculate. I wondered myself if maybe Urasawa has a particular fondness for Germany, and that may be one reason. I don't think the reason, but one reason he may have set something in Germany. But to me, it comes down to two things, at least what I can ferret from Monster that we've read so far. One, I think it makes perfect sense in that Tenma is Japanese. Mm-hmm. And he comes to Germany in order to work with Director Heinemann of the Eisler
Mm-hmm.
Hospital, which is how the book opens. And so, there's a reason why he is there. But I think that it really works well that a Japanese doctor, a very gifted Wunderkind doctor, mm-hmm. is in Germany because he becomes an outsider. I mean, we see him as an outsider from the very beginning. Now, at times in the art, it's difficult, if not impossible, to realize this. In other words, if you didn't know that Tenma was Japanese, you wouldn't know it from the illustrations because, he really looks like about everyone else. But we're reminded throughout, both by his name and also by people referencing him as Japanese or the Asian guy or that yellow guy, because you're yellow, you stand out, that he is someone who is an outsider. And I think that this outsider status is one of the main things that moves this narrative forward. Now, another reason that I find it interesting that Urasawa is using a German setting is to tap into a rich history. Now, you mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think that it was genius the way that Urasawa sets up this long narrative by kind of straddling that time of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, because it does drive much of what is in this book at the beginning. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's anchored in German history. And then later on, we get other elements of German history, especially with, in Volume 2 of the Perfect Edition, the introduction of the neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
And the character, the baby.
Yeah, and he does... I was just about to say, playing off of what you said about Tenma as an outsider, that he does address racism in Western Europe in several times. Like you said, the neo-Nazi gang does some interesting stuff with them, and then later in the story he talks about how he introduces a kind of one-off Vietnamese doctor who kind of relents that her father was kind of barred from practicing medicine because he was Vietnamese, and she's kind of a victim of this racist society, and so I think that he definitely does do interesting things with Tenma's role as an outsider, and Tenma being Japanese, being Asian in Western Europe. But on that same note, he does also weirdly draw like a kind of racist caricature of a Japanese businessman in the later volumes, and that really struck me as odd because he's Japanese, and it's just kind of a character who's only in the comic for a few panels, but he really does resemble like Yellow Panic caricatures from the early 20th century, and that was some odd. So there's definitely some interesting, multifaceted stuff going on with the race and with being an outsider and stuff like that in this series. I don't know if you picked up on any of that at all, or...
Oh, I definitely did see where he was playing around not only with issues of race and ethnicity, but also a variety of other social issues. And again, I think that much of this comes back to the German setting. So, for instance, and I think this is in the second Perfect volume, where we're introduced to Herr Hartmann. I think that's his name. And he's the guy who had been the caretaker of Dieter, or at least when we first see Dieter. And he, at one point, had run an orphanage, or at least was part of a team that ran the orphanage. But we come to learn that it wasn't, in East Germany, it wasn't just any run-of-the-mill orphanage. It was one that was being used by the powers that be to experiment on the children, psychologically especially. So, I mean, there's something very evil about that. And I think that, again, the German setting gives Urasawa the opportunity to really play into a lot of the politics and the secrecy that we found going on during the Cold War, and even after, but especially when it comes to, let's say, the communist regime, East Germany. So, and that what was going on over in East Germany is not that completely different from what we see going on with the neo-Nazis later and their attempts at, changing the political and social order.
There's you could definitely make that connection, between the way things are and how the way things are, or the way things were and the way things are, and how there's very little has changed. I think there's. I don't know if I've ever seen Monster talked about in terms of how it deals with these kinds of issues, but there's certainly a surprising amount of material to talk about, and I think that speaks to Urasawa's competence as a cartoonist and as a writer. I think Monster does an excellent job of demonstrating the kind of the versatility of Urasawa and his ability as a cartoonist. Because there's a lot of that kind of richness there, but it's also a pretty straightforward adventure thriller series. So,
oh yeah, I think it's definitely something that our listeners should check out. So, and as we had mentioned earlier, the 5th volume of the Perfect Edition came out I guess just a little more than a week ago as we record this. So definitely do that. And there's more that we could discuss regarding Monster, but do you want to move on to the second title that we're looking at this month?
I think we've done a pretty good job of covering Monster, so we can move on to Enclosed Called Fat.
And the next title is Enclosed Called Fat. This is by Moyoco Anno. And Shea, you're the one who recommended that we read this. I was not familiar with Enclosed Called Fat, but when I read a little bit about it, a little summarization blurb, I thought, okay, this would be perfect for the show. Now, had you read anything else by Anno before?
I had not. I had meant to pick up Insufficient Direction, which was kind of a slice of life book that I think Vertical put out, I believe a year before Enclosed Called Fat, but I hadn't actually gotten a chance to read anything by her. But I was familiar with this title because I had read a really good review on the Comics Journal by Katie Skelly, who's a cartoonist I'm a big fan of, and she did it about this book, and I kind of piqued my interest. So it was one that I had wanted to get to for a while, and this seemed like a good opportunity. So that's kind of how I was familiar with it. But I hadn't actually read anything by Anno before.
Okay, because I was looking her up, and I mean, this is the first thing that I've read of Anno's, but she's also written things Sugar Sugar Rune, Happy Mania, and Hadaraki Man, and I'm not familiar with any of those. But then when I was looking her up and finding out who this author is, I found out she's also a fashion writer. And, of course, the whole fashion thing feeds right into Enclosed Called Fat. And I know I used the word feed there. I didn't mean to be punny because, as we will see in a moment, this has everything to do with eating. But I found it interesting in looking up and finding out that Moyoco Anno is also a fashion writer. I found pictures of her, and she is quite striking. I mean, she is someone who you would expect. She looks the way she does as a fashion writer. She's someone who seems very, who could wear fashion well. Let's just say that.
I hadn't seen pictures of her before, but as we were talking, I Googled her. You're right. She does. This definitely seemed like someone who, when you picture a fashion writer, you picture someone who is living all the things they write about, and they're wearing all the clothes. They talk about and write about, and they're walking down the catwalks and stuff like that. And she definitely seems like someone who is definitely capable of doing that now that you mention it.
Mm-hmm. So, let's get into Enclosed Called Fat. Now, this is a work that was originally serialized in the magazine Weekly Yoshai, and this is an example. If the first book that we talked about, Monster, is an example of seinen, here we have an example of Yoshai. Manga. So it came out in Weekly Yoshai magazine between 1996 and 1997. It was collected I guess in Japan in 1997, and then it was published last year, wasn't it, by Vertical?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is one that's been out for about a year, but it's one that we nonetheless thought would be great to discuss for the podcast. And so, as you may discern from the title, In Clothes Called Fat, this has everything to do with women and the way that they look at their bodies and themselves.
Yeah, this was. I think this is a really good book to talk about and to include in the spectrum of things that we've already covered, because like you said, Monsters, Seinen, and a lot of the books that we've covered before, like Opus and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Akira, would be Seinen, which for readers or listeners who may not know, is basically describes the demographic of people that the comic is pitched at. So Seinen would be, young men 18 to 34, whereas Josei, which we haven't talked about really, is kind of that same demographic for women. It's like younger women, 18 to 34. And so I thought this would be a really good one to talk about, because it is, in a lot of ways, so different from the other books that we've talked about.
Exactly. So, I mean, we have talked about titles that could qualify as shonen, I guess. I don't know, maybe Sojo, I don't know, but yeah, this is kind of a different book to discuss in a variety of different ways. This is a 1-volume read, which is actually another reason why you and I decided on this. That's the thing about doing a manga series, and Shea, this is something you and I talked about at the very beginning when we were kind of mapping out this idea, is the challenge of picking titles that do not have a very long and literally voluminous history. Because, I mean, it's all we can do to keep up with series like Monster and even JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, except, the other month when we did JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, in those new editions, there were only 2 of those larger, I guess, omnibus-like editions out. So that was a little more manageable. But, with In Clothes Called Fat, it's just done in 1 volume, and I like that.
Yeah, it definitely made it easier to talk about than something like, I don't know, Naruto with its 90 volumes.
yeah, I don't think that'll be a topic of discussion on this show, or at least anytime soon.
Maybe I'll sink my life savings into it and get it and read through it, and I'll just do a 1-man episode.
Yeah, it could be a marathon. Even that would be a marathon episode. Yeah.
But I would never. I don't think either of us would ever ask the other one to make that time or financial commitment. Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. So, where do you want to start with In Clothes Called Fat?
I guess one of the things that I've been. I guess we can start with the thing that I've been thinking about most since reading it was how do you feel about it as a work overall? Because I think it's a really strong work. I liked it quite a bit. I think Anno is a really exceptional in terms of aesthetics. I really like her aesthetic as a cartoonist. But I felt like the ending was kind of unsatisfying in a lot of ways, and it did kind of hamper my overall enjoyment of the book. I was wondering if you felt the same way about the ending, or if it more or less worked for you.
That's interesting that you ask that. There were a lot of things that I definitely wanted us to talk about with In Clothes Called Fat, but the ending wasn't one. But as soon as you mentioned it, I remembered, okay, of course, we should talk about the ending, at least without giving away spoilers, because I don't want to do that. Yeah, I do want to get to at least some aspect of the ending in a discussion today. I guess I feel okay about it. There were parts of it, I think, in terms of time, the way that it was temporally represented, that was not confusing, but had me wondering why Anno decided to do it the way that she did. Now, I don't know if that's where you were going in asking me about my feelings of the ending. Are you thinking that the ending may be a little too pat?
Well, no, I just felt like in terms of what it... I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this, but it felt like... it just felt unsatisfying. It felt like things were kind of moving at one speed, and then of a sudden they accelerated and they kind of wrapped up very quickly.
Oh, I
and
see what you're
like,
saying.
Yeah, it felt like the I guess the pacing of the ending wasn't consistent with the rest of the book, and it just felt kind of off to me, and it just felt kind of unsatisfying. I was just kind of underwhelmed by the way the way she kind of drew out that ending, and I was wondering if that kind of, if the speed at which she kind of wrapped it up worked for you, or if you were kind of more or less satisfied with the quickness with which she kind of tied everything up.
I don't know if I want to say satisfied, but I will say that I don't think that the way, or the pacing, or the shift in pacing that we have at the very end affected me as much as it did you, because apparently you thought more of this than I did. I thought I noticed it, but it didn't bother me, really. And maybe that says something about the story up to that point and what that meant to me. Now, before we get any further, we've talked in a very general sense about what's going on here, but let's give a little background, or at least a setup. Now, this is the story in Close Called Fat. The protagonist is named Noko Hanazawa, and she is in her 20s, correct? So she's out of college. She is a salary woman, I guess. So she is working for, what is the business that she works in? It deals with finances.
I don't think they ever really specify what either her coworkers or her boyfriend do. It's all kind of vague business. They do business. But I don't believe they ever kind of state it outright.
Well, we know that Sato is who's a trader at a big company, and that because at one point early on, one of Noko's coworkers says something about, "Oh, your boyfriend is a big part of a big trading firm." Mm-hmm. So we know a little bit more about the business that he works for than we do what Noko where she works. Now, when we first see Noko, we see not an obese woman, a young woman, but someone who has curves, let's say, someone who is rather plump. In other words, she has a weight issue. And, weight is not so much the problem as it is her relationship with eating. And we see in Close Called Fat, classic examples of bad ways that people use food, as comfort, as ways of dealing with stress, as way of finding peace, something that they do on their own. And, you can say this with any kind of substance that could become addictive. Alcohol would be another example of something like this. So we see, Noko has an eating problem. And along with that, she has a body image problem. However, the guy that she's been dating for 9 years now, 8 or 9 years, his name is Sato. Is that how you pronounce it? Saito?
That's how I pronounce it. But as we've established,
Saito or Saito? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I pronounce it Saito. So
yeah. So now he is much more popular. He is more svelte to begin with, and we kind of wonder at the very beginning. They seem like two very different people. So what is it that Sato finds attractive in Noko? Is it that he is just a good-hearted person who only sees the insides of Noko and not the outside? That's what it may appear at first, but then we learn that this group of coworkers that Noko is a part of. So we see Noko at the very beginning with 3 other coworkers, and of this 3, one of them, named Mayumi, she doesn't seem to be a bad person at first, but at one point early on, Noko thinks that she may have seen her boyfriend Sato with Mayumi, but then she wonders, why would that be the case? Well, come to find out that Sato is seeing Mayumi on the side, and Mayumi is everything that Noko is not, in that she's very, very thin, she's very svelte, she's very sexy, she's very sensual, very alluring, very, very fashion conscious, and very superficial. And she also values people according to what they look like and what they possess. And that is not Noko at all. So it tells us volumes about her boyfriend, Noko's boyfriend, Sato, when we find out that he is drawn to her, and even though he feels kind of bad for being in a relationship with her, he can't seem to tear himself away from Mayumi, even though he keeps saying, "I'm not going to see you again." And then he goes back to her.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing this book is really good at addressing, probably better than anything else I've seen. There may be books out there that do a better job of it, but I haven't read them. It does a really good job of kind of at least trying to explore issues of self-esteem. In Noko, there's some body dysmorphia issues, and her narrative is very much about her relationship to her body, and how she perceives herself and how she thinks other people perceive her, and how that affects her. But then also, like you mentioned, Saito and his relationship with Mayumi. There's a lot there where Anno looks to explore his relationship to his self and his relationship to his self-esteem, and how he engages with people because of that, and stuff like that. And so there's definitely a lot going on with Anno, or not Anno, but Noko and Saito, and it's more than just a book about eating and stuff like that.
Oh, exactly. And in fact, Noko, as you probably could predict, she decides to do something radical when it comes to her body. So, she comes into quite a bit of money in a very unusual manner. I don't know if I want to give anything away here, but it's kind of funny how she gets all that money. But then she uses that money to pay a clinic to help her reduce her need for food. And so she goes there, and it works a little, but not much. But then she discovers that when she starts purging, she finds results. And so that's where this eventually leads. And I don't think that's a spoiler, because you can tell from the opening pages of this book, the way things are set up, that this is where eventually Noko is going to find herself. She does lose, quite a bit of weight. Radically so, to where she becomes a different person in a sense. And so we do get to see a lot of the psychology that goes on. So when earlier, Shea, you said that this book does an outstanding job of showing issues of self-esteem and interpersonal relations and why people do what they do to themselves and to others. I think that the Noko is just one example of this when it comes to her relationship with food and the way that she sees herself. But there's a lot of psychology that goes on in here. So, for instance, we even get to see some of the psychological turmoil going on with Mayumi. Who's the least attractive character in this book, but still she's someone who, there's some contorted reasons why she's doing it, and some really, pretty fucked up reasons why, Mayumi is doing what she's doing. Nonetheless, we get to see the psychological mechanisms that are going on. And so I think that Anno does an exceptional job of showing the inner lives of these characters.
I think Mayumi's character does it is almost cliche what Anno does, but she establishes Mayumi as the kind of conventionally attractive, very popular beauty who everybody kind of flocks to and everybody loves, and everybody kind of wants to get a piece of. But then she reveals that she is, as far as people go, she's the worst person. She's torturous and she's mean and cruel to people just because it pleases her. And then Noko's narrative is obviously about coming to grips with, it's about how you feel about yourself and not how other people see you and stuff like that. And so what Anno does is very cliche, the message she's trying to, or it seems she's trying to communicate. But I think she does a very good job. I think Mayumi's character is she's cruel, and she's a good character, but she's a really bad person. Mm-hmm. And I think the way Anno kind of pits Mayumi against Noko in these ways that feel very organic and feel very original, it keeps it from reading as cliche as it could have.
Right. And Anno does this with the visuals as well, pitting one character, Noko, against another, Miyami. And I want to point out something that I have noticed in this book, and this is not just with Mayumi, but we see this with most of the really skinny or skinny-ish characters. If it's a woman. If it's a woman in Clothes Called Fat, and they're very, very thin, or at least thin, if not very, then they're usually shown with disproportionately larger eyes and lips, but especially eyes, because you can see many, many examples of Mayumi in this book where her eyes seem to consume a good proportion of her face. And then especially when you contrast that with Noko. Now, when we first see Noko, and throughout most of this book, we see her where she is overweight, and her eyes and her mouth, as well as her nose, but especially the eyes and the mouth, are more or less proportional to the rest of the face, as humans usually are. But then once Noko begins to lose weight dramatically, we see that her eyes look as big as Mayumi's. And so it kind of demonstrates an emaciated look by showing those big eyes, but I think that there's something more going on there, because there's something freakish about the look of not only Mayumi and then Noko when she gets really thin, but also some of the other female characters who seem to be a little too thin with these really big eyes.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that I really liked Anno's art in this, and I think she does a really good job of drawing those gaunt, emaciated figures that it does. They do kind of seem underfed, malnourished. There appears to be something wrong with them. There's a couple panels, and it's just really small things like this where if you look, you don't really see Noko's. It's after she's kind of started to lose weight, and she's had tremendous results, and she's looking like really trim and very, very skinny. There's a couple panels where you see not her body or her face, but you see just her legs, and the way Anno draws her ankles, the fact that the way that she so very clearly overly defines those ankle bones kind of sticking out almost through the skin. It's just small things like that I think Anno does that communicates that so well, so effectively. That there is something wrong with them physically. There's something not healthy about them. And she does it with these very small things, like just the way she defines those ankle bones. I think she does an excellent job of communicating the health of those characters. But like you said, there is something to be said. Maybe Anno was stylizing these characters, these thin characters, and so when they got skinny, they were almost inhuman, and it matched their interiority. Maybe there's something there. But I really was taken with the way Anno stylized those skinnier women.
Yeah. Let's get back to the art of Moyoco Anno, because I think you raise a good point. And I want to talk about that and then kind of segue into another distinctive feature of Enclosed Called Fat, and that is Anno's narrating style, or narrative style, I guess. But in terms of the art, I think that this is a great contrast to most of the manga, not all, but most of the manga that maybe a good part of it that we've discussed on this series so far, especially with Urasawa as a good counterbalance, because Anno's art reminds me of the kind of alternative manga that I think once or twice we've looked at in this series, as opposed to Urasawa. I think he's a good example. Again, incredible artist, but it is a very detailed, and in fact almost photographic in places, way of illustrating characters and especially objects and setting. But with Anno, it's a much simpler, reserved, stripped down kind of art, and I think that more than anything reminds me of the kind of alternative manga that we've read one or two times for the show. Yeah,
there's Anno's art is definitely of a piece. It's very different. It's very, I guess, it's different than the things that we've seen before. I would say with Urasawa, you mentioned that his work is very detailed and very photographic, and And I would argue that the biggest influence that, I mean, and this is speculative because I don't know what his reading habits are, but I would argue that his biggest influence, at least to me, is Hergé, the Tintin cartoonist, just in the clarity and the sharpness of Urasawa's line. So Urasawa's definitely, I would say Urasawa's, in a lot of ways, his work is more stylized than some of the work we've seen before from like Katsuhiro Otomo, Sakura, and even in a lot of ways, Hirohiko Araki's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But even beyond that, like you were saying, I would definitely agree that Anno's work is even a step beyond that. Her figures are very thin. All of them, even characters like Saito, who we're not led to believe are unhealthy. There's a trimness to him, and a looseness almost to her lines that I think it's really well suited to her content. I think the way she draws and that stylization, the way she draws those kind of big bug eyes, and the way she draws those very angular faces and very, very thin extremities, I think does a really good job of playing into what she's trying to do with the narrative, with the story. But yeah, I would say she is definitely the most stylized cartoonist that we've talked about so far on the manga podcasts. And one of the things that I kind of noted and wanted to talk about her art was the way she draws hair. And I don't know if you noticed this, but I was really taken with the way she draws hair and the way the strands of hair are just thick brush strokes of ink. Then you can really see where the brush moved and how the brush moved. And so the hair becomes these kind of like thick strokes of ink and chunks of that blackness that are edged with these very natural, organic edges, and the kind of shine and glisten of the hair is just white space that wasn't inked in, and I was really taken with that, just aesthetically, that look of the hair really, really worked for me, and that really stood out for me, and I really liked it.
And you're talking particularly about Naoko.
Yeah, I think her hair is definitely drawn that way. But Saito's also, I noticed in a few panels, a few close-up panels, that his is just created from these just thick brush strokes of ink, and I, for some reason, that just really worked for me. And I don't know, were there any details about the work that, and I've already mentioned the way she draws ankles. I really liked how she did that. But were there any details like that really stood out for you that you wanted to talk about, that kind of elevated the work for you, or anything like that?
Well, I will mention that in terms of the hair, I think that Anno effectively does use Noko's hair. Of all the female characters, she's not quite, but she's about the only female character in Close Called Fact that has black hair. And so in that way, she stands out. So I think that visually, not only does she paint the hair in, as you put it, a very stylized and striking way, but she does so for a narrative purpose, and that is to make a character stand out in a way. I mean, this is the central character, after all, and she's very different from everyone else around her. All the other female characters, blonde hair, especially the more prominent ones. But in terms of her style, and I want to get to something that I mentioned earlier, and that is the narrative style, the way that she uses the art to tell the story. We were talking about this being a very psychologically grounded narrative. In other words, we get to see characters and how they function and why they function, many times in a dysfunctional manner. But I think that the psychology is literally drawn out in Close Called Fat, in the way that Anno tells the story, because there are a variety of instances where certain characters, and the best example of this is Noko, where we are focalizing things through her. And so she may be experiencing something in the moment. She may be conjuring a memory of the past, And at the same time, she's doing both of these things. She may be projecting a fantasy. And the way that Anno does this is to give us not so much different illustration styles, but to show different characters. So, for instance, one example, and I can't point to it right now, but I do remember that, Noko is going through some kind of situation that she's going through in the moment. At this point, it's fairly early in the story where she is, quite chubby. And then she's fantasizing about herself in the future if she should happen to lose weight. And so in the midst of the scene where she's engaging with someone, we see an image, a quick image of her, maybe one panel or two panels at most, where she is very thin and she looks quite different. In the way that Anno even does this kind of psychological revelation with speech balloons and text within this story. So if a character is, like, for instance, Noko is thinking something, then and it's not external speech, then many times that text is words that are without a bubble of any sort. It's just hanging out there in the air, so to speak. It's just planted right there in the panel. But when it's speech, then of course it comes from a speech bubble. But sometimes if someone is thinking something, then there will be a thought bubble, but that's a little different from a kind of thought that becomes what you could say like an overvoice narration, right? A voiceover. And those, I think, that, Anno handles differently. Again, the text right there in the panels without any kind of bubble whatsoever. So I think that the way that Anno chooses to tell the story and how characters are anchored not only in the present moment, but in other psychological moments that are going on simultaneously. I think she effectively tells the story that way as well, which just adds to the psychological depth.
Yeah, I think she certainly is. She's certainly a competent cartoonist, and she knows how to utilize the different tools in her toolbox. She knows when to use the speech bubble, when is the huge kind of floating text going to be most effective. She definitely knows how to use those techniques to their fullest, and I would say I definitely enjoyed that too. I definitely it added something to the work. The fact that she did jump from speech balloons to thought balloons to the kind of captions or the boxless captions. She didn't relegate herself necessarily to just one or the other. Like some cartoonists, or in American comics, we have a lot of writers who prefer one over the other.
Right.
I like that she was able to use the different tools at her disposal kind of interchangeably. I think that definitely did add to those moments. It heightened those moments. It heightened the drama. It heightened the oomph of some of those moments.
Exactly. And sometimes those, and I was just flipping through as you were talking, sometimes those unanchored text examples serve as not just voiceovers, but maybe counterpositions. Let's say Noko thinks one thing, but then, she has a counterpoint to something that she just, a point that she just made, and that's represented differently, with the unanchored text. So, I do think that Anno's art is very different from most of the things that we've seen so far in this manga series. And I really like it. I want to check out more of her work.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to track down to see what I can find. I'm excited to get into one of the books we mentioned earlier, Helter Skelter by Kyoko Okazaki. I have heard that was kind of a protege of Okazaki's, and then Okazaki kind of pushes some of the themes in Anno's work, like Enclosed Called Fat, kind of further than she does. So I'm definitely excited to get into that. I'm definitely excited to get into more of Anno's work. And I was really struck reading Anno's work how similar aesthetically the way she renders people was to the work of Ai Yazawa, who's done things like Paradise Kiss and Nana. And I really like the look of that comic, the look of that kind of people. So I might give Yazawa's work a shot, just because the two aesthetics kind of resemble one another. But yeah, I was really taken with Anno as a cartoonist with this book. I was a little disappointed in the ending. I still think unsatisfying is the best way to say that. So it wasn't as good as I had as I thought it was going to be. About halfway through, it kind of didn't stick the landing, but I was really taken with it, and I'm definitely going to check out more of her work.
So there you go, the two titles that we have discussed for the July manga series. We started off with Naoki Urasawa's Monster, and right now that is up to 5 perfect edition volumes. And then we turned to Moyoco Anno's Enclosed Called Fat. So a lot to discuss and a lot of good manga to read. So if you want to find good manga, then you can pre-order it by going to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to their website, dcbservice.com, it's a great place to pre-order the manga that you will find out there. But right now, if you go to the website of DCB Service's sister company, and that is InStock Trades, InStockTrades.com, you can find all of the books that we have been discussing on this episode of the manga series. And in fact, if you go there right now, as you're listening to this, and then type in go to InStock Trades and type in Enclosed Called Fat, you will find that you can get that book at InStock Trades for 25% off of the cover price. So instead of paying $16.95, you can find it for $12.71. And then if you go to InStockTrades.com and type in Monster Perfect Edition, then you will find all of the Perfect Edition volumes that have come out so far, all 5, at 30% off the cover price. So instead of paying $19.99 for each volume, you'll get it $13.99. You can't beat it, Shea.
Nope, that's I love good deals, so I might go there.
And you should. It's the place to go. So whether it's dcbservice.com or instocktrades.com, you can't go wrong with those guys. Go there, get a discount, and then tell them we sent you. And after you do get your comics there, then get in touch with me and Shea and let us know the kind of manga you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you will find on the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or even your mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple to use. Or if you want to get in touch with us via phone, the old-fashioned way, our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Shea, how can they get in touch with you?
I am Shea at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And thanks to everyone who continues to retweet our tweets. We appreciate that. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and now on Pinterest. Yes, we do have a Pinterest page now for all of you Pinterest fans. We also have a YouTube channel, so check that out if that's the way you like to consume your media. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and our comics-related commentary that we put up on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways of getting in touch with us, Shea.
Yep, I think that's all of them.
Yes. So we like to hear from you. What do you think of our manga show? And if you have recommendations for future episodes, manga that you think Shea and I should discuss, then chime in about that as well. So until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.